Morning, everyone. Morning, and welcome to our webinar on the leader's role in return. I'm delighted to say that Mark is going to be taking us through a new white paper, which I'll be sending you by email after this webinar. So I'm going to hand straight over to Mark, but just to say, there's going to be lots of interaction as there always is on our webinars. So make sure you find the chat box and look out for the polls that come up as we go through the webinar. So Mark, over to you.
Thank you very much. I poured myself a cup of tea. I'm moving up closer to the screen. I'm ready. So to echo Joe, thanks so much for joining us this morning to talk about the leader's role in return. You know, whether you're planning to return, whether you're returning to work this week, or whether you are full back at work, whether it's in the office or working from home, that all of us are starting to think about returning to work. When we, as the Innovation Beehive, traditionally talk about disruption and the disruptive times that we're living in, we would normally talk about it in the context of The Innovator's Dilemma, Clayton Christensen's seminal book on disruption of markets by AI and the rise of technology. But we've started talking about disruption rather than with a capital D, we're calling it disruption with a small d, because all of us globally, whether we are full-time, part-time, whether we are self-employed, running small businesses, or CEO of multinational organizations, all of us have been impacted and disrupted by COVID-19. We're all trying to make sense of the economic impacts and understand our cash flow, what our customers might want in the future. We're all starting to make tentative looks to outside, whether it's social distancing in our local garden centre, or whether it's about how can I actually get to work using public transport or alternative methodologies. And some of us are still working from home and will continue to work from home using the technology that we've all got so used to after our steep learning curve over the last couple of weeks. And we continue to learn. I mean, I think it's quite interesting. We are all talking a lot about curves and letters of the alphabet. I am so used to seeing new data every single day, trying to make sense of the data sets, understanding whether we're going to be in a U-shaped recovery, a V-shaped recovery, an L-shaped recovery session, whatever it might be. But we have definitely changed. It is a different world, a disrupted world where we're all looking for assurances and for some sort of way forward. And as a result of that, we have been moving through a series of phases during our current pandemic. During this huge turbulence, we have looked back at previous periods of turbulence, whether it's the financial crash of 2018, whether it's the flu pandemic of 1918. And we were talking before this actually happened to a number of leaders about how they worked their way through this disruption with a small d. Many of you joined us on our webinar and we shared our white paper where we plotted that out in the roadway through uncertain times. Well, we're moving out of the second stage sustain now towards and into return, moving into what we call the next normal. Now, the reason we're not talking about the new normal is because we believe that just as new information, new problems, and new challenges, new customer expectations and new employee expectations have continued to evolve daily and weekly during the last couple of weeks as we've gone through the sustain phase. We believe that as we move towards and move into the return phase, nothing will be set. We will see changes through all of our key stakeholders. So it's about what next normal am I in today or this week? And leaders must know and be assured that the normal they are in on a Monday will be a different normal on a Friday. And by having that mindset, thinking about the next normal as opposed to the new normal, it sets you up to be able to ride that wave and understand that things will be constantly changing. Everyone is trying to map a way out and to map a way to return. Just an example there, the government on Monday published a 60-page white paper in the UK about the pathway to return. I haven't read all 60 pages of it, but I cut a couple of bits of you there. Everyone's trying to find their way through the pandemic and find their way through the roadmap to ultimately face to return and then renew. And we were interested, Joe mentioned that we were going to have some levels of interaction. I'm interested, are you out there, where do you feel you are right now? Are you in stabilize still, trying to really understand what's happening and how can you operate during this? Are you in sustain, in lockdown, keeping your business going in some way, shape or form, or keeping engaged with your people, whether they're furloughed or not? Or are you thinking about return or in return? Or are you in the fourth phase, which we're picking up in a couple of weeks' time, renew, where you're setting new goals and looking to the future and emerging out of COVID-19? So we're going to do a bit of a poll, aren't we, Joe?
Yeah, here we go. That should have appeared on your screens now. If you can't see the poll for any reason, just type into the comments box where you feel you sit, looking at the 4 icons on the roadmap through uncertainty. And it's very interesting, actually, because given that there is so much uncertainty, and also the government in the UK, at least, is talking about phased returns for different industries. So we were really interested to know whether there would be a difference in responses. And I can already see, as those responses are coming in, that indeed there is. So that's very interesting indeed.
Wow, that's a very broad split.
Yeah. We'll give a few more seconds for a couple more responses if they're coming, but I think just about everybody has done it. So I'll share that, and then Mark, do you want to talk through the results?
Yeah, so what's fascinating here, our delegates on the webinar are share across each of these phases. So some people are still in phase 1 of stabilizing, just trying to understand what's happening and how can they continue to operate what we're understanding what is happening. A significant amount of people are in the sustain phase.
And that's not really surprising, is it? Because we're moving through the roadmap.
And we talked about the sustain phase is a marathon, it's not a sprint. And we'll find different industries. So for example, the hospitality industry will actually be in the sustain phase, probably a lot longer than other industries, as they're not really due to be opening till July or August, whereas construction industries are moving out of sustain and into return, and garden centres have opened in the United Kingdom this week. We have quite a large percentage of people, 42% of our delegates are looking towards return. So you're in the right place today to talk about the leader's role in return, and next week we'll be talking about real detailed, practical hints and tips and things you'll need to do to make sure you're best set up for return. And I'm really warmed and pleased actually to see that 16% of people are in renew already, moving beyond being frozen in the post-COVID-19 world, facing the organisation to the future, setting new goals and thinking about where can we go to a future together, different looking, but from here. And that will be actually the subject of our next white paper.
But it's worth noting that because of the nature of uncertainty and the nature of this global crisis, it's not going to be a bad thing if you find that you slip back into one of the previous stages, because we are on a journey and journeys have ups and downs. So it's great to see that so many of you are in the renew phase and moving into the return phase. And we've had a really interesting comment from Karen, who said, we're in between sustain and return, creating the plan to return, but this will not be soon. And I think this webinar is going to be perfect for people who are thinking about how you will manage that return.
Yeah, I think there's 2 phases. There's a kind of prep for it, and then there's the actual return. And that return will be staged as well. So, we've seen a number of restaurant chains. Our client McDonald's are announcing they've opened 15 restaurants this week. They're looking to open a further 30. There will be cohorts of people coming back, and return, like sustain, will be a marathon rather than suddenly on next Tuesday we're all back to work. And just to reassure you, you will get a copy of this video and a copy of the white paper. We've had a comment there that some of the slides are slightly out of focus. Not quite sure why that is, but don't worry, you will get a copy of this and you should be able to see everything clearly on that as well. So now when we're thinking about return phase, this is all about looking towards the next stage. As you start to move out of sustain, near the end of sustain, you start thinking about return and what the next normal might be. It will kind of be split into 2 sections. Partly, as I said, the preparation for return, and then the phased return of your employees back to work, and hopefully your customers back to your organization. Now, what's interesting, you'll have to juggle as a leader lots of different emotional responses and practical responses to return. I read this morning that 22% of Londoners in a recent PwC poll said that they never want to work from home again. Now, I've been hearing and reading all about people saying, oh my goodness, it's been amazing to work from home. I love working from home. A fifth of people in London, and that probably says a lot about the actual amount of physical space people have had to work in, say they never want to work from home again. Although at the same time, 60% of people in the same survey have said they are more productive when they work from home. So quite incredible. A leader will have to manage all that. Not only will it be the attitudinal response to people about returning or continuing to work from home, there'll be practical things, whether or not, the schools are open, whether people can get childcare, whether people can commute into work. So we're going to talk to all of those practical and cultural and emotional concerns as we go through the webinar. But we're interested to find out from you, actually, what are your concerns, or what are you hearing from your people about their concerns about moving to the next stage of the roadmap through uncertainty into return? So if you'd like to share your concerns or what you're hearing in the chat box, then we can share them with the group here. What concerns do you have, or do your people have, about returning to work?
I can see that Rachel has mentioned that in hospitality, they're in the sustained phase for planning for return in August, because of course there's been a sort of tentative roadmap released by the government to give a sense of when you will be able to return. So that's really potentially helpful, but bearing in mind, of course, that they said that's dependent on a number of variables. So Josie has mentioned safety as a big concern, absolutely. And we're going to talk a little bit about that later on.
Yeah.
And then Angela has mentioned balancing homeschooling and work. Yeah, and that's something that we need to think about for ourselves, but also for those in our team as well. Keeping people safe. And also, and that's an interesting point from Sally, actually, inspiring confidence. So there's taking the steps to make sure people are safe, but then there's also perhaps communicating about those effectively and taking iconic actions which demonstrate that you're thinking about it as well.
And there's a bit around, so again, we were talking to one of our clients yesterday, he's opening up this week, and they've got posters all over their building saying, stop, walk this way, wear your goggles, have you got your gloves on? And we were also talking about, is there something that's a little bit softer, that like, are you okay? Do you need any help? Rather than just barking safety instructions that will lift the sort of the blood and your heart. Is there something around that we're taking care of you type messages as well?
And that connects to what Jules has commented about the new rules and protocols and social engagement. And as Mark was talking about around the next normal, we might find that those change over time as scientists discover more about the virus, but also as the state of the epidemic hopefully decreases over time. Managing feelings of fairness and flexible work options. That's an interesting point, actually. Managing people's response to the steps that you put in place and making sure that there's fairness and that people feel that there's equity.
I've been reading a little bit around sort of people who are working at the moment, feeling slightly beginning to feel slightly resentful of those people who are receiving either at 80% or a full top up from their salaries, who are able to be at home, whilst their colleagues are putting 10 foot to the dozen to make sure that the wheels stay on the organisation. And after weeks and weeks and weeks of 10, 12-hour days and often being on 24/7 to respond to crisis management, those individuals who are left in the organisation are starting to say, it doesn't feel very fair that my colleagues who are getting, in some cases, their full salary are watching Netflix and baking cookies, and I'm being asked to keep the boat going.
And there's a great point that's come in here about the hospitality sector. So, we want to return to work, but will our customers have the confidence to come back to a restaurant or theatre, even with social distancing and hygiene measures in place? And maybe that speaks a little bit into what Jules was suggesting, Sally was suggesting about inspiring confidence. So finding ways not only to keep people safe and put those structures in place, but also how you communicate about those externally to your customers as well as to your employees. And then people are less keen until they know it's safe. So yeah, absolutely. There's a huge piece around confidence, both from employees and from customers. And then practical things like childcare and how can people socially distance when children are involved. That's a really important point from Josie.
So if I think about my nieces when they were, certainly when they were in nursery or in the early years at school, it was all about hugging and being incredibly tactile. There's very hard to think how you'll take a year one class and try and socially distance them. And parents are rightfully concerned about that, what that will mean for their children. So lots of things, shared responses there, and I think a lot of common threads are coming through. That idea about needing to inspire people actually has been held very, very paradoxically by leaders over this pandemic. So there is, in Jim Collins's fantastic book, Good to Great, if you haven't read it, he talks about the Stockdale Paradox, which is based on Jim Stockdale, who was a prisoner of war in the Vietnam War. and actually when he survived the Vietnam War and survived many years in incarceration, came out and actually stood as a vice president candidate for the United States. He was asked, how did you keep going during the dreadful time you were in? And he said, my advice for people is that you have to have faith. You will prevail in the end, regardless of the difficulties. And at the same time, must confront the most brutal facts of your current reality, whatever they might be. That paradox of having to be honest and open about the health of the business, about concerns about health and safety, about how you'll have to work together, comes again into sharp focus as we start to move out of sustain and into return, because you'll be holding all of those concerns and challenges that you will have personally, your customers may have, and your employees may have, and they'll look to you for honesty and transparency around it. And at the same time, you'll be trying to move people forward, inspire people, bring together a sense of collective purpose in the organization. And that duality of that paradox is exhausting. It also means that you'll have to continuously look at new data sets and potentially change your instructions and change your directions on a daily or weekly basis. So whilst trying to give people the confidence that you know what you're doing. So it's a very, very difficult time for leaders, but there are some potential opportunities and behaviors that will help you as you begin to return and think about, how can I lead my people and inspire them, and how can I practically set it up for them so that they are able to deliver the work that's required of them. The first behavior is make sure the decisions that you make are data driven. This will avoid you getting wrapped up in the emotion or making decisions that are more gut reaction as opposed to based on pure fact. Now, a way to make sure that you are basing your decisions on pure data and not any unconscious or emotional bias is to learn from the dogfighters of World War II. They practiced, or those fighters that statistically survived more than those fighters that didn't, they practiced what was called the OODA loop. So when they were engaged in the enemy in battle, the OODA loop allowed them to observe what was in front of them, orientate the situation, so understand all the data points, make sense of what was happening in front of them. Having done that, decide what they need to do and then act. And it's the same for leaders as you're having to examine and observe new data sets, new pieces of information, new guidance from the government, new expectations of your customers, or new concerns of your employees. Orientate yourself to really try and interrogate that data set, but ask yourself continually, am I being emotional about this? Am I bringing some unconscious bias? Am I bringing my own perceptions and my own concerns and my own fears to this? Can I put those aside to orientate the correct path out of this data and understand where we actually are? That will then enable me to make the best decision I can make at the moment and then act upon that decision. It's really helpful also to be transparent about how you are making decisions with your team. That will give them a sense of confidence in the decisions that you're making. If you say, I'm going through this process, this is how we're using the information, I will update you as much as I know on this particular date, but be honest and transparent and open, and say that your position may change as emerging data sets or new information emerges. Now, by making sense of the data and being very transparent with your people around how you're making decisions, it will allow you to move into the next behavior, which is about prioritization. You will have a lot to do. By prioritizing and navigating all of the hundreds of different tasks that you have to do, it will allow you to create workflows. I saw that Karen has a working party meeting this morning to actually start to navigate the way into return. That's fantastic. So by prioritizing all of the different tasks you have to do, you can build workflows and start to chart who needs to do what, where, and when. But you will have so many tasks that you need to do that can potentially seem overwhelming. So again, talking to leaders and CEOs in businesses, we've discovered there are roughly 5 buckets that they're using to help prioritize the many tasks that will need to be done to move out of sustain and into prep for return and then return. Now, these aren't in any particular hierarchy, but they are safety, thinking about the impact on the customer and customers' expectations, looking at the finances, cash flow, what can you afford to do, where does your investment go at the moment, the well-being and security and engagement of your staff, and then how you communicate, how often, and what methodologies you use to communicate. Very important, as we will see people coming back to work in cohorts, and making sure that people who aren't in the office are receiving the same information in real time as those individuals who are in the office. Very important when you're dealing with crisis management. Now, we've got a bit of a poll, actually, thinking about the prioritization areas that we're hearing from CEOs and HR directors of where they are focusing to return to work. Which are the two biggest priorities you are thinking about as you start to return to work? Is it safety, customers, financial, well-being, communication, or is it something else?
Results are on their way in.
Yeah, absolutely. It's almost like Who Wants to Be a Millionaire? We can see the answers, but you can't. Right. Wow. Okay. Fascinating.
Yeah.
Give you a couple more minutes and then we'll see. So is it safety, customer, financial, well-being, communication? And remember, we do have the chat function. If you want to comment particularly around why you put that answer, we'd love to hear why that was important to you.
Great, I think just about everyone has completed it. So let's end that poll and share the results. So when we were putting this together, I initially had a single option choice for this poll, and Mark said, you know what, most people will probably choose safety. And as you can see here, he's absolutely right. 70% of you said safety was one of your top priority areas. And I'd be quite interested to know, actually, is safety the number one priority for most of you? The results would indicate as such. And then interestingly, well-being comes second. So that's it.
They nudge alongside each other, don't they?
Yeah, absolutely, because that's your own well-being and also the well-being of your team.
Put your oxygen mask on first before you assist others. Important during this pandemic. As a leader, you must take care of your own well-being, or you can't take care of your people.
Yeah, absolutely. Tracy, I can see you said you've been voting based on conversations you've been having. Have you been having those with clients or leaders or in the organisation? And Lucy has said safety is our number one priority. Communication and well-being are put together for us as a company, right? Okay, brilliant. So yeah, safety is number one, and I think it's not surprising at all that.
Yeah, and interesting, you know, we would say that you have to put the customer at the heart of your business, and any innovation that we've done previously has thought about what are the customer's needs and expectations, unless it's an internal HR or business process. But even then, we're thinking, how does it impact on the end user and the customer? That customer is scoring 20% there. And I'm not surprised, because it's about making sure you actually have an organization that is fit and well. And I was watching Alistair Murdoch, who's an old colleague of mine. He's now the CEO of Burger King UK. He was on GMB this week, and we've been chatting it on Instagram. And he was talking about there on GMB about how they have streamlined their menu in their opening stores. And he particularly said, not with the customer in mind, but thinking about our staff and their safety and their well-being, making sure that as you are assembling a meal for someone, you are not having to cross over with a colleague, and there's no risk of breaking social distancing rules. So actually, in an organization that's all about delivering hospitality and a meal to their customers, has thought of their employees first. I think that's being replicated right across the UK, and is evident in our poll results there. Yeah. Any other comments coming in, Joe?
Yeah. So we've had a couple more coming in. Karen has said that she thinks there are high levels of anxiety from people. It's not going to be a simple switch, absolutely. And I think, you know, well-being and communication and safety kind of combine. And Rachel has said safety is the one that leads on to the rest, to look after the people and the customers. And that's absolutely right. I think you put the safety in place first as a sort of, as Maslow's hierarchy of needs talks about hygiene factors, doesn't it? And those hygiene factors are going to be literal and metaphorical at the moment in terms of safety. There's a lot more than just the baseline hygiene that you need to be considering.
Now, we've been looking at what's been going on in China, because it's a pretty good indicator of what will happen in the rest of the world. And absent rates in China, bearing in mind, often workers live on site. And can't necessarily call in sick, because they can literally be sort of, you can go to someone's apartment and say, are you really ill? Averaging about 5% before the pandemic. And of a workforce that is well and ready to return, they're now averaging 20% absence rates, where people are just concerned and anxious and don't actually want to return to work. And that's an environment where often you live at your place of work. So I think we can expect potentially absence rates, people coming in, having concerns and then having to go home, people coming in initially and saying, I've changed my mind, I don't want to do this working pattern, or my family are concerned about me, I want to work from home. All of those sorts of things, leaders are going to need help with from their HR colleagues, and all of us are going to have to deal with as we start to return to work.
And I would say, the 20% of people focusing on the customer as their sort of first or second priority. This is a list of prioritization. It's not that we're only saying we're going to do the top two. And it's worth remembering that our customers are they provide the lifeblood of our organization. So as you move into return, I would say be careful not to have any blind spots. And if, just make sure customer isn't one, because customers are going to be the core of your renewal as an organization.
And we'll talk a lot about in Renew around trying to understand what the next normal is for your customers and gather insight. Thanks very much. That's great. Thank you for sharing that and for your honesty in sharing what's going on for you and your organizations at the moment. So another behavior that is helpful as you start to move towards return is what we call startup leadership. So Eric Ries created the lean startup methodology when he looked at what startups were doing and how they really listened to the voice of the customer and created a feedback and experimental loop where they built a product or a service or experience. They then put it out there in the marketplace to their end user and tested their response to it. They found out what worked and what didn't work. They learned from having tested that prototype, and then they iterated it, rebuilt it, and put it out there again. And actually, as we move into, we've been experiencing a lot of this over the sustain phase, but we'll experience it more and more as we go through the preparation for return and into return. We will build a policy, we will build a process, we will build a way of working. You have to think about the fact is that once you build it, you haven't built it for finality. It may change, it may need to be adjusted. Think of it as just testing your new policy, testing your new process, testing your new way of working, learning from your customers and your employees about whether it works for them. Again, using data if you can to understand that. And then being ready to act like a startup, show startup leadership and rebuild it, test your second iteration and learn about whether or not that works as well. Practicing startup leadership also helps you get away from the idea of, I fixed that, now I can move on to something else, because that I think is dangerous. Or, goodness, I put something in place, it's failed, I've not achieved as a leader. Realizing you are not going to be able to come up with the right solution 100% of the time, first time, instead of which you are thinking of it as building prototypes, testing whether they work in the next normal, learning what works and what doesn't work, and then rebuilding to make sure you meet the expectations of your employees and your customers at this time. Because as you start to navigate return, there will be hundreds of different tasks for you to do. You can get, I'm thinking, Karen, what your meeting will be like this morning, I'm sure there'll be reams and reams of actions that come out of it, really practical. But there'll also need to be cultural aspects that come out of it. Yes, we'll need to make sure that we are being hygienic, that maybe offices are flowing one way, that you're offering appropriate PPE and you're working different hours, etc. But there's a piece also about managing the culture. How do you keep people together as some people start moving together in a socially distanced physical space? And some people still remain at home with their dogs barking, with their wallpaper on display, and their children shouting, I want my lunch, mum, when they're on a call about budgets at 1:15. But over the last couple of months, we've really started to break down the boundaries of professional life. We've become a bit more human. We've seen each other's wallpapers. Those hierarchies that we've seen existing in the past have been swept away as senior leaders have given broadcasts to their organizations from the hall or inside a wardrobe or wherever any of us could actually find some peace or quiet. And I think one of the things that's come out of COVID-19 is the real embracing of us being more human and more authentic. And we must try, as we think about what are our learnings, what are the experiences from COVID-19 that we can take forward into our new world. I really would urge us to keep the humanity in this, not get overtaken by the process as you start to think and prepare to return, but keep hold of some of the beautiful humanity that's been shared and experienced over the last couple of months. And I've got some examples there of people who are really going out of their way to support each other. Quite emotional stories of care workers sleeping in tents in the grounds of care homes. A little note that came through the door here in the village that we live in about I can help if you're self-isolating. The Thursday clap initially for NHS and then moving into key workers. And of course, you know, the wonderful Colonel Tom. So fantastic. So holding on, because the temptation will be to start creating workflows and forget the human side of it. Because as we return, there will be two different aspects for us as we navigate through. The first is the practical side of it. The first thing is we know that there will be ongoing and continually updated government guidance, wherever industry we're based in, whatever country we're in, and we know that we have colleagues and clients from across the world who will listen to this webinar. Even we have clients in the United States, you'll have different states that will have different guidance. But your primary concern, as is revealed in our poll, will be about safety first. Alongside that, it's about making sure that your office is set up in the most appropriate way and that you're delivering PPE to people if they're on the front line or even in their offices, making sure that you're protecting people through PPE. It is no doubt that office hours and working hours will change. You know, you can see already there's been talk in the newspapers about construction sites going on to 9 p.m. at night, taking advantage of summer daylight. Something that I've seen when we've been working before in Asia, where actually often construction sites work late into night to keep the sun when they've got the sunlight. You'll find that some of your team will probably start returning in cohorts. So you may have a group 1 that returns initially, then a group 2 and a group 3. What you have to make sure and be conscious of is that you don't find out that you have separate teams within your own team. So how do you make sure as a leader that those teams keep connected? You'll probably look at things about whether you can operate your business over a 6-day week. We're hearing that from people as well. And you may have different start times. You may have people that start at 7, at 1, at 4 p.m. All of those different working hours and different working patterns will be a challenge for you as a leader when you think about how you can create that sense of community and how you communicate to people when you've got different shifts at work over multiple days and some of your workforce working from home. Now, as people start coming into work, you'll have to have a responsibility also to think about if people are traveling on public transport, where does my duty of care to protect them start as an employer? Is it just when they get into my car park or at the bike racks? Or do I start to think about how do I protect them on the way to work? Do I give them PPE? Do I flex knowing that someone's going to be walking into work? Is that 1 hour it now takes them to work part of their working day? Or do they have to get up an extra hour early to do that? All of those sorts of things will depend on your organization. But I would counsel the duty of care also extends to helping people get into work and protecting them to be safe when they're on their way to work. And once they're in, we'll have to think differently about all those amazing communal spaces. Here's a picture of Airbnb's communal space in London, a great partner of ours. This is what they call the Village Green, where we've held many events. I know some people on the webinar today have actually attended our events at the Village Green. Nice to see you attending our own Village Green here online. But you'll have to think about these spaces, repurpose them as you start to look at the density of your office and spread people out. We expect spaces like this to be filled with desks now. How do we know that innovation happens, that collaboration happens, that culture is built when people are able to work together in these communal spaces. How do you replicate that when you no longer, rightfully for the time being, have that communing space? How do you commune and become a community when there is no place for you to commune together? And finally, it's not exhaustive there, you'll also need to think about entrances. So visitor reception areas and staff entrances here. Here's a picture of an Amazon worker going into work in one of the warehouses. You know, how do you protect those reception areas? What do they look like? Do you have temperature monitoring? What sort of PPE and sanitation facilities do you have available? Whilst at the same time being careful that you don't just look like Fort Knox or a hospital as well. Having to balance all of those things, those practical measures, and many more will take up a lot of the leader's time over the coming week. And there's some comments have come out here, isn't it? So I'm going to survey this to assess concerns and build plans. That's great to see. Lovely, great. Well, I was just wondering, actually, I'm thinking about other practical matters that you're having to deal with at the moment. When you're thinking about returning to work, or if you have already returned to work, would you share in the chat some of the practical things that we haven't talked about that you're having to deal with, so we can learn from each other? So what other practical considerations do you believe we'll need to address as you return to work? We'd love to see you sharing that in the chat.
And indeed, if you have any plans or you're thinking about any ideas to actually address some of the practical considerations that Mark has talked about, please share those as well. One example that I know of is my friend works in the NHS, and they've split their team of nurses into two. So he hasn't actually seen half of his colleagues for the duration of lockdown, because they've been working separate shifts on separate days, whereas before they would ordinarily have been in the office together. So he's been working from home some days, working remotely, and then going into the office on other days. And that has ensured that they have a sort of almost like a business continuity plan, if you like. So if one person in one of those teams was to get coronavirus, then they would still be a team operating, and they'd be able to effectively serve their patients.
And we've heard about other clients of ours who are currently literally putting one-way signs in their head office and banning use of lifts, which, if you're in somewhere in Canary Wharf on the 59th floor, that's going to be quite interesting about how you get up to the 59th floor when you arrive to work. So one way. Thinking about lavatories, public loos, things like that. Is it one in, one out? Thinking about, we talk about those conversations that take place at the water cooler. Well, you'll have to have single-use utensils. If you have a staff canteen, that's going to be really hard. Are you thinking about doing sandwich deliveries to people's desks? All those sorts of things.
Yeah.
So lots of practical things that will need to be considered. There's also a number of cultural things that will need to be considered as you start to plan and consider the return to work and return to work. The first is actually, we think, a really, really vital part of any culture, any organisation. It's about stopping and pausing and celebrating success. You will have people who really will have gone the extra mile for you whilst they're not furloughed over the last few months, celebrating those heroes of COVID-19, people that went above and beyond, or just those that just kept working when everyone else was, watching Netflix and baking cookies. How did they do it? Stop and pause and recognise and thank them. But also look for those heroes who weren't necessarily at work, who kept the team spirit going. So we've got a client of ours, a large hospitality client. They have an online Facebook group for all of their people, and they've all been furloughed, these hospitality staff, but some of them are running quizzes. Last Saturday, one of them had an online disco and was DJ for the night, and they had hundreds of members of staff logging on for a live discotheque that somebody just in one of their outlets decided to run. That person definitely deserves some recognition. But pausing also to think about and recognise some people will have gone through some very, very tough times. They may have lost some loved ones. They may have had friends who lost some loved ones. They may have been ill and sick themselves. So taking time just to check in with people, to recognise where people are, meet them at that point. And again, go to your HR colleagues if you need help and support about how to have those difficult and tricky conversations. You may not be a trained counsellor or a trained therapist. You may get into difficult territory. So making sure that you put people towards any employee assistance programs that you have, or get help and support from your HRBP will be vital. I think HR has become the leader's best friend over the last couple of months. And as we move into planning for return and actually into the return phase, HR will absolutely need to be a partner to the business. Did you have a comment there you wanted to?
Yeah, so a couple of comments came through in relation to the last slide. Rachel, who works in hospitality, has said they're thinking of having a toilet attendant who cleans between every use, cutlery being delivered in plastic bags, etc. What I love about the toilet attendant piece is that actually it kind of harks back to days gone by when there was a toilet attendant who would clean your hands for you. And
give you $1 for a lollipop.
And there might be opportunities. This is going to sound very odd, but there might be opportunities for customer service in that. And what I mean by that isn't that you necessarily serve people whilst they're in the toilet, but that you can engage with people because you have a member of your team who is out in the front house a lot more than you would ordinarily have.
I would love to see, actually, even in office environments, I'd love to see the leadership team playing roles like that as well, actually being of service to their people, because it's the way they interact and engaging with people as well.
And Tracy has mentioned about the well-being impact of the practical measures that are being put in place. And I think there might be a couple of pieces that come up in the culture slide that you're talking through now particularly around inclusion, that might speak into that.
Okay,
So.
super. Lovely. Thank you very much for that. The second piece of the culture section of planning for returning and returning, we've already talked a little bit around cohort working, different shift patterns, people working different days of the week. So making sure that you keep your digital capability. We've all learned after a bit of a steep learning curve how to get on Zoom, how to use Teams, how to use WhatsApp, etc. But thinking about how can your tech enable you to actually keep people engaged and keep people talking and keep your communication, which we know from our initial poll was really, really important. As you communicate, thinking about whether or not you are including people and making sure that you're also listening to people is a vital part of how you communicate during return. It's really tempting to, and as a leader, think, right, I've had my communicating briefing, I've recorded a video, I've sent something out on WhatsApp, I've sent something out on Teams, to go into broadcast mode, to reassure people, to give them a sense of wellness, to take people with you. You also have to make space and use technology so people can actually be heard and have an opportunity to talk and feel listened to. One way to do that is to think about all of the steps on the employee's journey into work and through return, a bit like a customer's journey. So mapping what it might feel like on their journey to work, what it might feel like on their first day, during their first lunch break, during their first team meeting. What will the team meeting be like if only 30% are in the office? Mapping each of the employee touch points of their day working with you as you would map a customer's journey, and particularly thinking there about how do you manage the touch points of some people who are physically in the office and some people who aren't. And I think a way of doing this is really to start thinking, particularly in preparation phase, of getting your people to contract how they believe they'll work together through return. So asking your team, how do we want to work together? What barriers might we see overcoming? Here are some of the challenges I think we'll need to address. How can we agree to behave as well as practical steps? Saying we're going to put teams in place, we're going to have a camera during our team meeting is not going to make people feel included. You'll have to contract behaviours so you're aware of how you behave to make sure that that 70% that are watching the meeting are not just watching 30% of people have a meeting. So are there any other cultural aspects that people think they'll be addressing or have started to think about? It'd be great to hear what you're considering or what you're thinking about in the chat. As we move on to think about as well as the practical and the cultural aspects, thinking about what skills will we need in the organisation. So as we move into the next normal, we know that business and life will never be the same. We know that our customers and our employees' expectations will have changed. So we will need a new skill set to be able to deliver on the needs in the next normal. Now, many organizations have pivoted, have already completely adapted the way that they've been able to deliver their business during the pandemic. You've got churches going online, you've got pubs, local pubs delivering and doing takeout, you've got garden centers doing collection through Facebook, all sorts of really innovative ways. Those organizations that have been really successful up to this point and before COVID-19 have been the ones that have put themselves in their customers' shoes. As you start to move through return and into renew, once you've got all of the factors around practical and culture in place for your team, you will need to put your head above that for a moment and start to think, what does my customer need now? What are their expectations? And then what skills do I need in my organization and what talent do I need in my organization to be able to fulfill those new needs and those new expectations? Now, each organization will be different, but again, talking to CEOs and HR directors and other leaders, we've identified 3 territories that we believe are the skills that will be needed in the next normal. The first is what we call innovation, and that is about, we've demonstrated a lot of that during the sustained phase of the roadway through uncertainty. This is about understanding the new problems, the unknown unknowns that you're being addressed, that will need to be addressed as you move through return, and drawing upon the skill set of the innovator, their toolkit, to be agile, to come up with new solutions, to adapt, to build it, to test it, to learn, and continually iterate your solutions with new challenges and new problems and new opportunities as they emerge. Also, alongside that, making sure we don't lose the digital capability that we have within our organizations. We have absolutely connected so much online as individuals, as teams, and as families, and important to keep that capability and leverage it as we go forward into the new world. That will hit up against, though, our interpersonal skills. So as we start to think about what the customer needs and what their expectations are, starting to think about how can you build relationships with people in the new world when you're in cohorts, when you are practicing social distance. How can you build empathy with people that you only see for the next 4 or 5 months in one dimension? How can I be aware and with using emotional intelligence of how I am communicating and how I'm taking other people's communication on board? What story am I telling myself and how helpful or how unhelpful that is? And particularly those individuals who perhaps have worked in hospitality or in a sales situation, how do you keep relationships when you're either working remotely or you're practicing social distance? Now, I've been listening to a CEO of a large pharmaceutical organization talk about how his workforce, his sales reps, spend 100% of their time going into GP surgeries, selling new drugs in America. Now, for one, GPs don't have spare capacity to see sales reps at the moment. Two, you don't want lots of people coming in unnecessarily into surgeries. And three, actually, people's expectations of how they work and spending 100% of their time out there on the road have changed. So you will definitely begin in that industry to see more remote relationships. But how do you keep that deep relationship with your potential customer when you only see them in 1D? And the third, we have to get jobs done. This is about, the third territory is around execution. This is about really understanding when you are not physically sitting next to your employees, when you're not all together in the same space and your line manager doesn't have line of sight towards their employees. High levels of trust are required, building teams where people trust each other to get on with it, using interactive tools like Slack, or whether it's Miro or Asana, to actually manage workflow, but allowing people to have elements of empowerment as they're not able to pop up to see their boss every 5 minutes or to get instructions from their boss. We'll also rely on people being much more motivated, much more personally engaged, and have a real sort of self-starting motivation. So 3 new skill areas that we believe will be vital to take us into the next normal and into the new distance economy: innovation, interpersonal, and execution. So we're interested to hear from you, actually. We've talked a lot about our view on what we might need to do to move through into the third stage of the pathway through uncertainty, what questions you'll need to answer as a leader, thinking about some of the practical and some of the cultural elements that you'll need to be concerned with, and also thinking about how do you build the skills and the talent in your organization as you move forward. Before we depart together today, I'd be very interested in hearing in the chat, so what will be your first step as you start to move and plan for return in your organization?
And I can see Rachel has a question which kind of ties into that question, which is about if you only need to bring some staff back, how do you choose who? Mm-hmm. So to answer that point, Rachel, next week on the webinar, which you'll be able to join with a QR code on the next slide, and I'll also send a link out, we're going to be talking about some of the practical tools that leaders can use in the return phase. And one of those is going to be, what are we calling it, a skills map? An employee skills map. So that'll really help with that. How do you manage those who want to come in but are not chosen, and those that are asked to come in but who think it's unfair that others are still at home? And that comes down to the cultural points.
Culture and negotiations, working with your HR. What roles do you need? Every organisation is having this challenge. You'll also potentially have a challenge that you want people to come to work who don't want to go to work. You know, I was reading in the paper yesterday, an HR director was talking about they're starting to bring people off furlough, and some people don't want to come off furlough. They don't want to because they're quite enjoying being at home at the moment and getting 80% or a 20% top up to 100% of the salary. All of those sorts of conversations will start to take place over the coming weeks, and we'll be addressing some of the real technical, practical side of that in our webinar next week.
And Karen has said that she's going to create a structure for the working party using our slides.
Yes,
So
our job
thank you,
is done
Karen.
today.
That's
If one
great,
person
Joe.
is helped from today's webinar, you said rather grandly, but that's fantastic, lovely. And Angela, I'll start to use the phrase next normal. Love it. Oh, I thank you, because I do think new normal. We've stopped using the word unprecedented, by the way, because that's well overused at the moment. But I think that the new normal, again, is not true, because you will absolutely have shifting standards. It is the next normal. When we go back to work at week 1, it will be different in week 2, in week 7, in week 17. We have to be aware of that.
And another suggestion is looking at a survey for potential customers on what would make them feel confident to come back to a restaurant.
That's great.
I think that's a really good
Love
idea,
that.
getting into your customers' shoes. Definitely. Yeah, brilliant.
Great. So, the thing is, customers and organizations and teams aren't static. You're going to have to adapt with confidence and look to the future. It's important that as you return to work, you don't remain frozen in a post-COVID-19 world, that you orientate the organization forward, that you set new goals, and that you look to the future with new opportunities. Perhaps looking at the meaning of the organisation and revisiting the purpose. And all of those things we'll be addressing in our next white paper that will be out in a couple of weeks. As Joe has said, we have a webinar next week. I believe you can scan here.
Yep, you just need to grab your phone, turn the camera on, as long as you have an iPhone, or I think Android does it as well. Scan the QR code and it'll take you through to the registration page for next week's webinar, which is all about the skills and the tools and going into some of the behaviours that you need to prepare for return.
Super. And we'll be sending you out our new white paper, which goes through all of the detail behind these slides this morning. That will go out to you today. So thank you very much for joining us. Thank you so much for your collaboration as well. It's great when we're moderating and facilitating these sessions that so many people have joined us and also are willing to engage and share their learnings throughout the community. We hope to see you next Thursday, the 21st of May at 9:30, when we're talking about preparing to return. But until that time, stay safe, be strong, and take care. Bye-bye.
Thanks, everyone. Bye.